next thing we want to move into is to hear from Susannah Wayland. So if we are right on schedule, a little bit ahead of schedule. So I think maybe, can we kind of do a camera on, show of hand, thumbs up, keep moving, or stop, I need to go get something, or cup of coffee, anything? I see thumbs up from the thumbs I can see. I see thumbs up, virtual thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So we're going to keep moving and hear from Susannah. And like I said, Susannah, we have been looking forward to hearing from you for a little while. So I'm going to turn off my mic, and we're really excited to hear from you. You know, family engagement is a whole field, right, of work and research and expertise. It's a whole set of skills and habits of mind. And so for us to really dig deep into engaging families around particular topics or subjects, or through PBIS, or to think about families that are that we might say have a shared set of needs or perspectives. And so that's where we are today, is really sort of developing our own skills and knowledge in the way we go about our work, so that when we work with others and we are there to sort of bring expertise and consultation around family engagement, we can lean in and say, let's think about our families who really don't have that secure home base that we really want for families, and that families look for. And so, and how do we see their strengths? How do we best partner with them and support them, and really wrap around and to support mental health and learning and all of the things that they as families hope and dream for. So I'm going to be quiet now, and thanks Susannah for talking to us today.
Awesome. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Be back with my old buddy Tom, who's going to be navigating me through this Zoom platform. Absolutely one of my most favorite things to do is to get out into the field, talk about this law and how it really supports families who are in very vulnerable positions, lacking, housing of their own. So I am excited to really engage in conversation, as Barbara introduced kind of the idea of what it looks like to be a family experiencing homelessness, and how we can effectively partner with these parents who are in really difficult situations. So I am going to just do an overview of the law for everyone, just to ensure that people understand what McKinney-Vento rights are, because I do believe going into our restart, whatever that's going to look like, communication is going to be key in understanding the provisions of this law, and all of us who are in education, and how we can be sensitive and communicate to the district liaison if we sense that there's an unstable housing situation, and just moving forward, ensure immediate enrollment, and more importantly, actively involved in their education. So go ahead, Tom. Okay, so Tom has a poll here, just by way of giving you an idea of how many students are experiencing homelessness, what their living situation is, hotel, motel. So Tom, you want to direct them, or do you just want me to say, everyone answer the questions?
Yeah, if you just wanted to take some time to answer those questions on the poll, we'd like to get a sense of what you think you know about students who are facing homelessness in Ohio. already kind of a spread across as people are getting those votes in. We'll give just about 10 more seconds to get your votes in there, and then we'll discuss these results. Thanks. So, Susannah, you want to talk us through some of this?
Okay, so this data is from school year 18-19, and it just helps us get a perspective of those who meet the definition of homelessness, which is any student who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And then, so the total number at the end of the school year 18-19, the answer is 25,606. So we were the ones that took 609. We're close. But so that gives us an overall picture. And then the definition goes to elaborate what those lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime housing situations may be. One of those is living in a hotel and motel. And in the state of Ohio, at the end of school year 18-19, we had 1,309 that met that housing status. So, and then finally, the doubled up is where 75% of our families who experience homelessness land in that category. And that means living with a friend or family member as a result of a hardship. And that number, you got that one, 64%, but 20,425 are in that status. So yeah, so does anybody want to comment, or do we want to just keep going through the slides? These are just we already did those, Tom, so we can probably move.
What was the answer to the last one?
The doubled up right there, 20,420.
Oh, there it is, okay. Thank you.
That's the.
Susannah, we can definitely pause at times and have folks.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
So if there's any.
Susannah, this is Anita. Is this data for K through 12, or what age group does this reflect?
You know what, Anita, that's a really good question. And Adam pulled this. The definition includes P through 12 as a result of the reauthorization. Preschool was now included. So I would have to believe that because it's 18-19 that it does include those preschoolers as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so this slide again just elaborates on the definition, meaning families that have lost their permanent housing, and therefore the three keywords are fixed, regular, and adequate. These are some of the other nighttime resident statuses that go with the definition. And it's important to note that again, campgrounds are those situations that aren't deemed normal or typical for that family. So we do have some families that do reside in year-round campgrounds as a choice. That wouldn't be someone considered homeless. It's only those who have lost and are residing in one of these situations, not really by choice. Okay. Okay, and again, the language in the legislation stresses that that shared housing situation is due to loss of housing, an economic hardship, or similar reason. This is important to note because there are some families who live in situations with multifamilies, and it's not due to hardship, it's a choice. It's also important to note that there are very varying ways that families fall into this definition. That similar reason is very open, but I will tell you, having done this, been in this position for a number of years, just when you think you've heard it all and you've heard those similar reasons, you hear another one. So for example, families who are experiencing the head of the household who has an addiction. So opioid crisis has hit the state hard. So oftentimes there will be children who have lost their housing because the family member has gone into recovery or simply just abandoned. So it's real important that liaisons, when they're determining eligibility, consider all of these situations: loss of housing and economic hardship, or a similar reason that caused the family to have to leave the house, the permanent dwelling. Okay, again, I'm just drawing attention to the three words: fixed, regular, and adequate. It has to be all three of those, or lacking in all of those, and in order for a housing situation to be determined not homeless, all three of these have to be met. Tom, I lost the presentation, I see.
I'm sorry, I lost myself. My entire
That's all right, I see.
computer. I am so sorry about that, but I'll have to take it up with
All
my
right.
laptop.
Here we go. Okay, so determining eligibility is a key issue, and communication is really important. That's why the liaison really needs to be someone who's accessible, approachable, and available to speak with the family. And sensitive questions have to be answered, and these are some. The one that sticks out the most and often provides the answer that the liaison needs is: where would you be if you couldn't be living with your parent or your grandparent or your aunt or uncle? And typically the family would say, I don't know, we'd be in our car, we'd be at the shelter or whatever. So these are just examples of questions that sensitively can be asked to determine whether or not that family truly is in a hardship situation. Okay, so then once a family is determined to meet the definition of lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, there are options for where the students can go to school. It's presumed, for stability and consistency of educational needs, that the student would remain in what's called the school of origin. So that means where the student was going to school when they were permanently housed. Or the family has the option to choose to enroll the students in what's called the local attendance area, and that would be where the family is now laying their head as a result of the hardship. So if they are now residing in a shelter in a different district than where the school of origin is, the family could choose to enroll in that district and attend the school of origin. However, that determination really needs to be made with best interest in mind of the student's academic success, and in conjunction with the parent. So oftentimes, the liaison or school members may not agree with the parent's choice, but it's important that the parent's voice is heard and that we follow what they want for their student. Yeah. Okay, and then enrollment has to be provided immediately, and that also can produce some anxiety for school districts because there's a lot of paperwork and things that typically parents are required to provide, right, for a typical enrollment. In a McKinney-Vento situation, families often don't have everything at their fingertips and at the ready to provide for enrollment. So districts must waive all the enrollment paperwork requirements for attendance for this to get the students immediately engaged. But that's not to say that those pieces of information aren't to be garnered later, if that makes sense. So we can't hold up enrollment, and we certainly want to go back and make sure we get all that paperwork. So districts need to work together to facilitate ease of record transfer, not hold anything back, even if there's a fee or fine attached to it, just work together to get that information. That's especially very important when we have high schoolers with credit situations. Okay, and then another one of the provisions of the law, which may be different looking, well, it definitely is looking different now, is transportation services. So if a family does choose to keep the student in the school of origin and there are a couple districts over, districts are required to work together to make sure that transportation services are provided, and that looks a variety of different ways. It's shared responsibility and or costs. So some districts will do AM pickup and one district does the PM, things like that. Or one district takes on the whole responsibility and bills back the other. But ultimately, we need to make sure they get to school. Yep, go ahead, Tom. Oh, I see somebody raising their hand.
Yeah. Sorry, I put in the chat that I had a question. So Susannah, I appreciate you sharing all of this. And I think like as a SST consultant, you know, these are the things that I often tell them, you know, it's like, this is what I have. But do you have any like coaching questions or thoughts around like, what are some ways that teams could walk through like figuring out that transportation piece? Because I hate to say, you know, the financial part of like with the school of origin and having these discussions with two districts, as sometimes like puts us as consultants between a rock and a hard place, and we want to be compassionate, you know, and put the child's needs first. But if you just had any like good tips to kind of have teams consider or anything like that when having these difficult conversations.
So so it's not not an option.
Yeah,
to say no. So here's
so
what I see, and so the liaison is charged with determining eligibility. So as a team in a school, when you sense or you know that a family needs the McKinney-Vento determination and supports, it really ought be put on the person in charge of doing that. So that kind of removes you from that role, but you're the eyes and the ears, so to speak, that informs the liaison. And then the liaison, and even if they have single points of contact at building level to make that determination or whatever, then the next thing that needs to happen is the liaisons are not transportation experts. The transportation experts are the bomb.com and districts. So we need to pass that off to the bomb.com people and not get involved in that. So it's sort of like staying in our lane, ensuring that we're doing the best we can to make sure families are getting what they need, but also staying in our lane. And so Alexandra and I have gotten really friendly with our transportation people at the state level. So we understand transportation even better than we thought we ever wanted to know, but we also now have that leverage. So when we hear a district liaison saying, I'm having a hard time with, can say, I understand, let me put your transportation in touch with my transportation. So I even stay in my lane that way. So it isn't so I hear like two things you're saying, the cost. It's gonna cost. It doesn't matter, you gotta pay.
Yeah,
and so you don't want funds to do that. So go ahead.
Well, and it's usually like the same districts over and over again that continue to have the same issues, but not being familiar with like their system barriers, you know, like, so if there's something that you notice, like maybe the liaison isn't like a clear role, or like just like what internally is typically happening that's keeping these same issues to keep arising. And so like if you had anything that you notice from that end. And I think I see Helen's hand raised. I think.
I just had a question kind of along those lines, but it happened this year and I kept going back with districts and a liaison. It was a parent family situation in another county. They had been formerly in the district, I think, that they wanted to go to. However, they had chosen something much farther away, and they don't really have the right and I'm all for families, don't get me wrong, but they can't just say, I want to go way to this, I'm not living in this area, I wasn't formally in that district, but I want to go to this other district. Does that make sense?
Right, so it's not a menu of options,
that's
which
what I just wanted to
sometimes
say.
families think. There is a distinct option of where they can go, either
Yes.
where they were before losing their housing, or where they are laying their head. And that can include community schools, so it's not always our traditional districts as well. But and then once that choice has been made, we have to honor that, even like if it seems too far to us, like that's too long of a, but we do our best to inform the parent, and then make do with what we have to. And then Tom has up the next slide, so I'm just going to kind of go into it, but we can come back if there's more questions. So then the idea is we honor whatever choice is made, and then if a district has a problem with that choice, there's a dispute resolution, okay? And that happens at the local level while the student is engaged and enrolled in that school situation. And that's really, really important. So we can't just withdraw students experiencing homelessness because we don't think they meet the definition or because we don't agree with what the parent has done. We have to honor the students' need to be educated. And I always say, and let the big people fight. So then there's a specific procedure that needs to be followed. There's a template on the website for districts, and they all, under federal requirement, are supposed to have that on file and understand it. Quite candidly, they don't always. So that's important. Again, as eyes and ears, we would make sure that that is being upheld, that students aren't being withdrawn or not allowed to enroll because the district has a problem with the choice or with what's going on. So yeah.
Susannah, we have another question from
Yes.
Krista. Is there any coordination with the point in time count in January? She mentions in their community, they have a community agency that works with the PIT count, and they advised they were trying to determine the number of youth who were homeless.
Right, so that's an annual thing that's done, I believe, through HUD. So that is not something that districts have to follow or support. There are districts that liaisons are part of that point in time count, but it's not a requirement. It does inform monies for the area of the continuum of care, but that definition looks a little bit different than our definition. So our definition includes those doubled up. Their definition does not include those doubled up. It's virtually out on the street or in a shelter type situation.
Thank
so
you.
I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you for the clarification on that. One of the things that they expressed, and they presented to our family council as well, was that they were trying to determine the number of teenagers who were homeless, because there seems to be teenagers who are homeless and we really don't have a good count of them. And so I wasn't sure if that in any way was something that you were seeing from the liaisons statewide, because anytime we try to get a count of our homeless teenagers, it just seems to be a moving number. So that's why I wanted to just ask that question, if there was any coordination or conversations between both agencies. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll elaborate a little bit more on that because it's not in the slides here, but unaccompanied youth are a big part of our homeless population, and those are students who lack, who are not in the care of a parent or guardian, and lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime housing. So those are our students that are, you know, what we call couch surfing, you know, sleeping on a friend's couch, maybe 2 nights one friend and 3 nights the other. So they very much do meet the definition of homeless, and are called out in the law as needing liaison support. In fact, they probably need more liaison support than the families by virtue of the fact that they don't have anyone typically to speak for them. Sometimes the host family will you know, be actively involved in that student's schooling and choices and things like that, and other times that family is just a place for that youth to lay their head at night. So that they are a very important part of the definition in our work. But they lack that parent support, right? So they need the school support and other people in their lives that can take the place of that loss.
Thank you very much.
How many young people would you say that involves in Ohio?
You know, I wish I had that number before me, and I just don't. So I don't want to even go there.
Oh, okay.
I should have had it pulled up. I'm sorry. And yeah, but it's a significant number. And I can get that to Tom for you all.
And more than likely, they're at least like teenagers, right? Or does it include other?
So that's the interesting part of the definition, is it's anyone who's not with a parent or guardian, and really it could be any age. So it knows no age. Our minds tend to go to that teenager, but it really could be an 8-year-old who's, you know, a parent, you know, is left for recovery and had to leave their child with a relative, again, suddenly and not planned necessarily. It's a result of a hardship, and the court is not involved. So yeah, it can go the gamut of the ages. It does.
So would they get health care, and is there any supports they get from a safety net?
So that's an interesting question, and in the state of Ohio, it's not very clearly answered. Okay. So I'm not going to take that one on. Typically, the concern is always like, what will we do if, you know, something happens to the student and their parent isn't there? And the answer is, you know, the hospitals are required to treat, even if the parent isn't available. So those people who do take these students in are protected, you know, by that, you know, by virtue of that. And schools shouldn't hesitate in those situations, because that would be the facts. You know, if they couldn't get a hold of the parent, they'd still treat the student with whatever emergency is going on. It's more the day-to-day needs that I think you're talking about. And I really can't speak very well to that. Yeah.
Maybe down the road, if you get a number, you can share with Barb, and she can, or Tom. And
yeah. The number that I most recently got was attached to age 18 and over, so I don't have the complete one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I will get that if I can. Okay. So just moving along. So this is what liaisons are charged with doing: supporting the educational needs of the student, ensuring that public notices are out, and this is a real important one for this time especially. So there's posters that have what homelessness is defined as under McKinney-Vento, And then at the, on the poster somewhere has to be a place for the local liaison's contact information, and then also the state coordinator, which would be me. And during these times, it's real important that these public notices are not just in the schools, but they're out in the community. So places that families experiencing homelessness would frequent, such as laundromats, libraries, those are closed now, but there will be reopening, I'm sure, at some point. So we want parents to have that communication. Currently, liaisons are actually putting, in Cincinnati, putting magnets in every food distribution bag for all families to have their contact information. So districts getting creative with ensuring that that information is out there, and who to contact is real important, especially during this COVID time. We've already talked about enrollment disputes. Liaisons are also charged with professional development, not only to support their needs to support families, so being trauma-informed, trained, etc., but also to ensure that everyone in the school district, from transportation all the way up to the superintendent, is knowledgeable about this law, can understand and the signs of homelessness, and then most importantly, in every district, understand the systems, policies, and procedures in place so that we can make sure all students are identified properly and given the services and supports.
Susannah, we have a question about that public notice component, and we were wondering is that reported in some way or monitored in some way? How do...
Yeah, it actually is, because it's a federal law. The federal programs at the Department of Education, they have educational support specialists who speak to districts about their title application, and one of the requirements for compliance is that public notice being up. So there's various ways. If they go on site, they look for them. If they're doing a desk survey with the district, they ask about, do you have them? So we have gotten much better as a state in ensuring that that is being upheld. And then we've had to get quite creative in our thinking for making sure during these COVID times that continues. So websites is another way that districts put the information out there as well. There's a parent brochure, a trifold that's available on the McKinney-Vento website, and that's another way that districts are distributing that information.
Susannah, another question just came in about unaccompanied youth, and someone asked the question, would that potentially include parents who get caught up in immigration issues or some type of issues with ICE or something like that, where the child is left but parents may be detained in some way?
Right, so again, it's dependent on their nighttime residence. So if they've lost their permanent housing, there's a hardship, right? There's one that's there and where they're staying. And again, just focusing on why the law exists, it's for stability and consistency of their education. So we reserve judgment on how they arrived at this situation, and our focus goes to how can we ensure that this unfortunate situation doesn't impact the student's education. And then we I work with all the other details that may or may not become clear about where those children may end up. But for the first and foremost, we just want to honor what they need educationally. Does that answer the question without getting involved in what may be down the road?
Yeah, I think the point that you make, that's a good point to make, and especially something that I know we worked on this all the time with both homeless and foster care, is that, like you said, the situation is not really relevant to us. If you are in school, you have these rights, and we're going to work on preserving those rights and ensuring that you get what you're entitled to under the law to be successful in an academic environment. And while we know that there's all types of things that come along with these traumatic events that result in people being in transitional housing situations, our job is to preserve those rights. And we're not really, professionally at least, kind of worried about how we've arrived here.
Right, and that comes into play a lot with our unaccompanied teens. I'll get a lot of calls that say, well, they just chose to leave their house, that, you know, they're not following the rules. We have to reserve all judgment. That can be really hard, especially if we're a close-knit community and we know the parents. Our job is to just say, it's unfortunate, we hope for reunification, but we're educating the student and giving them the best supports and services that that student needs during the situation where they're not resting their head at their permanent residence. And that, yeah, can't be more stressed, because a lot of times young people, we don't know what goes on under their roof, and they're making hard decisions, and we cannot pretend to even begin to know or pass judgment. That's not what the law is for. It's really for educational support and stability. And then also, I'm just going to put this out there, we follow the same safety procedures. If we suspect foul play, if we suspect human trafficking, anything like that, we report, but we have to resort back to the safest place for this student to be is in school. If there's anything yucky going on outside of school. So not enrolling a student because of X, Y, or Z is not a good choice for districts. They need to enroll and get them in a safe place. And if there's anything else that officials need to be notified, we have them in the safe space and we can follow up. So yeah, so this I think is our final slide, and it's just ways to support identification. Avoiding the word homeless, because again, most of the time we find families have a roof over their head, so they're like, I'm not homeless, but the key is they've lost their permanent residence. They're now living in a situation that's not their own, and life looks different when you're doubled up. And so we just want the family again to know what their rights are, because oftentimes these doubled up situations are not optimal, and families will endure some awful situations because they don't understand they can make the choice to move to maybe even a better doubled up situation. So it really is important that we honor communication and explaining that the rights exist for their students' best interest, and if they're in a bad doubled up situation, that they can move again, and the district will support that. Just asking the right questions is always important, being sensitive to the signs of homelessness. And then we have a housing questionnaire on the website that helps determine eligibility, but also can be used as an interview form. One of the key things in these situations, especially during COVID times, is going to be that liaisons establish the next check-in point with that parent and how best to communicate with them. That will be key, especially if we go back and then have to resort to online learning again. So just establishing lines of communication through that questionnaire format, which is typically like an interview. Making sure our community knows, reaching out to all the community providers. Liaisons need to really establish relationships, not because they have to be experts in the other person's field, but because we need to start pointing families to housing resources and food banks and faith-based organizations that can support, other needs besides education. So I'm going to stop. I feel like I've talked a lot, but I hope it's been helpful.
So here's maybe how we could use, we have a little bit more time for this, and then we're going to take a break. And so maybe we could, you know, go ahead and if you'd like to, you know, turn your camera on if you want, and maybe we can just have some questions, and we could use the chat. You can maybe wave a hand, and we'll you take turns sort of unmuting our mics and asking our questions. So we can use the next, say, 10 minutes if for that. Okay. And then, and I'm just going to put my question out there now since I'm have my mic open, and that is, Susannah, can you give us just a couple examples of where you've, or it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, the where you've seen it well, but what does this look like when you've just seen it done with excellence, when you've seen schools that have really gone sort of above and beyond in how they support these families and their children?
Oh, wow. There are a lot of districts doing awesome things. I can highlight, there's also 20 sub-grantees in the state of Ohio. So the state of Ohio has competitive funds for districts to apply to create programming to support additional needs for students experiencing homelessness. So I have been privileged to be on calls with all 20 of them throughout this COVID time. So for example, Canton did wellness calls not only to all their homeless families, but to all families in the district and checked on them. So that was like a beautiful way to make sure everybody was okay, and then also be able to identify if a family was, you know, because of the close proximity and overcrowded conditions, if they were going to move, so they could communicate, if you move, please contact us, please let us know. So those wellness calls were certainly awesome. Other things, we had a problem with shelters in the food service situation. So at one point in COVID, the nutrition service people could only issue a meal to a one-to-one situation. So one child, one meal. Well, there were shelters that wanted to send one person to get multiple meals, right? So that we're not sending all these families out and you know, increasing their risk and exposure and things like that. So the Department of Education quickly went to work and got a waiver for that. So now we can have a representative from the shelter pick up meals. And so that's kind of a statewide thing that really helped, but it was a liaison that brought that to my attention, and therefore we were able to get that resolved. Other ideas I talked about, the magnet. So Cincinnati came up with a magnet to put in everybody's food, their meal on one day. Again, that information will stick somewhere, right? So if it's needed, that support is awesome. Ensuring that hotspots were available, because again, we take for granted, you know, that everybody has a place, shelter in place, and can connect to Wi-Fi. And the shelters don't typically have Wi-Fi connection. So how could we support that need? Yeah. Any others like specific questions? Because I could go on, but just some really cool things going on out there. Just the delivery of, there's a district out there that's doing a delivery of food right to the homes, like just the above and beyond, you know, realization of the needs. Being aware that some of these families who are experiencing homelessness can't get in a drive-through line to get food. So being aware of that and bringing that to the distributor's attention, like how could we, you know, make sure this is available for all, not just all who have a car and things like that. So yeah, working together again, just to inform the community, you know, when the parent comes to the liaison with those concerns.
Other questions? Other folks want to wave a hand or use your reaction button or just turn on your camera?
Hey, Suzanne, I have a quick question. You brought up the subgrantees through McKinney-Vento. That grant competition, I guess two small questions. When does it run again, or when do you expect it to? And then do you allow consortiums of districts to apply for it?
So sure, we are in our third year, so the next competition will be for fiscal year 22 funds. So the RFA typically comes out and the bidders conferences will be January of 21. So coming up here.
Coming up.
And it's a 3-year grant cycle. And currently we have ESCs are eligible in districts and community schools. So we have not had, but you bring up a good question and it's open for discussion at the state. I'll bring it forth. Informal consortiums being, I think that's what you're referring to, like multiple districts that aren't necessarily under an ESC.
Yes.
That hasn't historically happened, but it's a thought.
So I bring that up just because, you know, traditionally some of those subgrantees are in more densely populated areas, and we know you brought up the opioid crisis and things like that that I think have affected more rural areas and brought to light some issues about transitional housing in places that it's a little more hard to see sometimes. And I was throwing that out there to some of our colleagues who might be in some of those more rural areas, that it could be an opportunity to try to bring your districts together to address an issue that you might be seeing emerge. And through applying through something like the ESC gives you a little more power and leverage to compete with those bigger districts.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have, rural districts that have been awarded funds, and putting them all together on a call is interesting to hear how diverse the needs are just based on the demographic. But that doesn't mean their needs are any less. In fact, sometimes it's more challenging because of lack of shelters and other resources that the big urbans have. So yeah, we do encourage all to apply. Wow, Meredith has a big question there. Does someone want to read that? And I'll respond.
It's not even a question. It's really just, I heard recently that like Uber and Lyft, their drivers have just simply stopped working at this time. So families without reliable transportation may have even more struggle finding a way to do things like drop off and pick up for school. So it's good to hear that some districts are able to kind of meet families where they are, because even their sort of cobbled together options may not be available right now, which is interesting to just think about, all the different ways that families who were, being helped by community partners, some of those community partners can't even help them right now because their own staff aren't allowed to drive people or drop off, and then those basic services like a taxi just may not be there anymore.
Right. And that's so important. I like the way you put that, to meet them where they are. And isn't that just a novel idea that we ought to be considering, especially in these times. Yeah.
So just in anyone else want to sort of share a best practice that they've seen? Susannah, we are super grateful for this presentation. It was very informative, and I think I think I'll be able to ask better questions and considerations. This is really help my understanding. Anyone else want to share something in one of the districts that you work with that you think is something that would be, something a recommended practice?
So Barbara, just something popped into my mind right now that I like a consideration that it seems so obvious that we didn't think about, even my sub-grantees, was the access to like paper and pencil and markers. And so like when a student experiencing homelessness, the first thing we think of when they're in school is give them a new backpack and give them markers and all that stuff. Well, it became apparent that, wow, all their supplies are at their desks in school. Like, so some of the stuff that we took for granted, we needed to like redistribute. So like, a parent confessed, we don't have any paper here. Like, so that was another reason to use the food distribution site again to reissue school supplies that, again, our minds always think, oh, we only need those at the beginning of the year. So that was another real cool aha moment, that people who typically have all that stuff at the ready in their home, and we needed to give that greater consideration too. So and I will just shout out the concept of needing social emotional support during this time, because this is traumatic and now it's trauma upon trauma, right? We already aren't in our own safe space. We're in somebody else's safe space. And so the need to consider social emotional learning and possibly some trauma sensory items in our packets as well as academics. So that was another real cool thing some of our liaisons have done.
Thank you, Susannah. I think as we think about this idea of universally designing family engagement, and we're thinking about all having access, all having the materials they need, all having support, this really helps us to think about all when we say all. So you probably hear dogs barking in my house, so it's a great time for break. So we have so Susannah, thank you for that presentation, and we're really glad that we can call on you with questions in the future. Let's we're going to set a timer for about 10 minutes. And if you have additional questions that come to mind, put them in the chat. You can always reach out to Susannah directly. Sorry, I'm trying to cover my mic for my dogs. And let's set that 10-minute timer, and we'll see you all in a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care.